Welcome to 1% Wiser. Today I am speaking with Oliver Burkeman. Oliver is a journalist and author of a number of books, including The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, and Help, How to Become Slightly Happier and Get a Bit More Done. His new book, 4,000 Weeks, is about making the most of our radically finite lives in a world of impossible demands and relentless distraction. In this wide-ranging conversation, we of course talk a lot about productivity, but also about everything from ordering Korean food at 2 a.m. in New York to why being a digital nomad is not all it's cracked up to be. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Oliver Burkeman. Hi Oliver, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for asking me.
So there's a huge amount I'd like to cover in this interview. I have pages and pages of questions, but obviously we'll have to see what we can get done in our limited time together. So I'll start with an easy question. Why do you think that we as a society are so obsessed with productivity?
Yeah, it's one of those questions you can answer on 5 different levels, and you could talk for hours about any one of those levels. I think a sort of obvious one is to say that there's something sort of very fundamental to capitalism, I think, just to go there right away, that focuses very heavily on sort of the instrumentalization of everything, of turning everything, time, resources, everything into the service of future profit, accumulation of wealth. I think, we are embroiled, sort of enmeshed in a system that is sort of fundamentally focused on productivity at the expense of other goals you could imagine for using time. But I also think that I'm never very fond of the explanations that just sort of put it all at the door of the system with a capital S or the man, because I think that there is something sort of totally fundamental to us as individuals that is older and more universal than capitalism, that wants to, both a good part, a part that I don't want to be arguing against, that wants to create and wants to push boundaries and sort of build things. And at the same time, a part of us, which I'm more focused on in my book, I guess, that wants to sort of deny the reality and the sort of scary reality of our being finite and having limited time. And so, you can use productivity and an obsession with productivity as a kind of emotional avoidance, right? Because if you're sort of always on the cusp of becoming perfectly productive and able to do absolutely everything and anything, you sort of don't have to face the consequences of being finite. I mean, you have to face them in reality, but you don't have to face them emotionally, I guess.
What you described yourself as a recovering productivity geek. What is it about using our time that most productivity geeks misunderstand? Or to put it another way, what have you learned about productivity that changed you from being a productivity geek into a recovering productivity geek?
I think the only distinction that I'm talking about there is primarily about becoming conscious of something that one is doing and why one is doing it. So I take productivity geekhood. It's not got an official definition, but I take it to mean anybody who's sort of really fixated on trying to build the perfect system of efficiency and organization that would enable them to implement every one of the ambitions that might pop into their heads, or to dispatch every one of the obligations that they might feel. And I think my sort of big change that sort of led up to being able to write this book, certainly, but my sort of big transition is just to seeing that why I was doing in the service of what, psychologically speaking, and that I was sort of, and I don't think I'm alone in this at all, that I was sort of focused on this ultimately mythical future moment of being totally in control, having my life sorted out, being on top of everything, in the promise that when that came, life wouldn't be intimidating and things wouldn't be anxiety inducing, and scary decisions wouldn't be scary anymore. And I think that the switch is into seeing that that's why one is doing that. I don't think the desire to have life not be scary and vulnerable and unpredictable necessarily goes away. But once you see what it is going on, you can at least sort of slightly lean into those feelings, to use an annoying phrase, rather than sort of spend your life in flight from them. And it's worth saying, I think the reason I think we should not run away from these feelings is not just because you should face the truth on principle, but it's that like all the things that we end up doing to not face the truth make things worse and mean that we don't get around to doing the things we want to do. Like I say, I think that's pretty universal among certain kind of person who's fixated on productivity. But I also think that the broader idea here about not liking how it feels to be sort of constrained by reality, I think that is pretty much completely universal, including among people who have no interest in productivity
absolutely.
techniques and stuff.
Yeah, I feel like there's, well, personally speaking, and not to turn it into a therapy session, but there's a certain level of sort of anxiety about doing enough and trying to get it all done. And did you ever feel like that, and have you sort of overcome this anxiety about trying to get it all done through this process of exploring this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the book was sort of self-therapy, and the explorations that I've made in this, in columns and elsewhere, are all sort of self-therapy, right? So they are kind of trying to come up with the answers that I need to hear. I think that's pretty much endemic to any kind of writing in the advice genre. Sometimes the people writing it don't admit that, but I think it's always, I think it's always true. And yeah, really, it's just one way of thinking about this is that, like, in these sort of very sort of slightly melodramatic philosophical terms, is that it's all about trying to confront mortality, and you end up reading a bit too much Heidegger, like I did for this book, and you start to sort of feel like it's all about staring death in the face, which is such a sort of huge idea. Totally don't think I have, conclusively or successfully stared my mortality in the face. But there's this other version of it, which is just the day-to-day mild discomfort that comes from not having that kind of control, right? So it's just like knowing that while you spend 2 hours on a piece of writing, your email inbox is filling up with things that you're not going to get around to that day, and just sort of and 1,000 other examples. And that mild discomfort, tell me if you agree, but I feel like that does ultimately come from the fact that humans die, right? It comes from this very big deal thing. But dealing with it on a day-to-day basis does not need to be a matter of some sort of wild-eyed confrontation with death. It's just about becoming a little bit more tolerant of a certain kind of discomfort and understanding that it's just inevitable.
Yeah.
And getting on with the things that you care about first, instead of first of all trying to eradicate the discomfort.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you talked a little bit about this sort of confronting mortality, and we're getting quite serious already in the first 5 minutes of this conversation. But I wonder.
Go on, sorry.
I was just going to ask, you recount having a bit of an existential crisis when you discover that, the title of your book, 4,000 Weeks, that being sort of the flash in the pan of our lifespan. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and how you kind of, if you came to peace with that, or how you have reached peace with that fact.
Well, I think it's totally fascinating that it has this effect, because it does on other people too, I have learned. And, obviously titling the book that way, I was hoping to be arresting and shocking. Not, I hoped, so alarming that people would like run away and not want to open or buy a book that had that message. So far it seems to be like I got the balance right, but we shall see. There's something really strange about how arresting it is to think in terms of a lifespan in weeks, I think. Obviously it's a little bit of a fiction, because A, it's kind of rounded to a neat number, and B, of course, nobody has any idea how much time they are going to get. People get both much less and much more than 4,000 weeks of life. But there's something about a week that is very, very short in your in your sort of lived experience, right? A week flashes by, like, where did the week go? It's a totally normal experience, a bit like a day. But on the other hand, 4,000 just isn't enough of something like that it doesn't feel like it's anywhere near enough. The number of days you get in a life is at least a very large number, and the number of years you get is not many, but at least a year goes on for a long time. So in the weeks seem to sort of really press the point. And yeah, I was sort of terrified, and then I started, as I say in the book, I started like randomly asking my friends, like, don't do any mental arithmetic, just tell me, how many weeks do you think the average human lifespan is? And people would come up with, like, they say 150,000, things like this, which, if you don't do the math at all,
Yeah.
doesn't sound wildly absurd, but it is, of course, wildly absurd. And yeah, like twice that is the 310,000 weeks is the duration of all human civilization. So I just think there's something very powerful about the number, but obviously the real point is just the finitude, right? It's the finiteness, the fact that there is a hard ending and that we don't have all the time in the world. I think that's the important part that the sort of conclusions follow from. It's nothing to do with the specific number.
If we could increase human life by 200 years or to 1,000 years, should we do it, or would that make life somehow less meaningful?
It's a really interesting question on that scale, because occasionally people ask this question, in the context of various Silicon Valley hyper wealthy eccentrics who may be working on these things, and they talk about like solving death, which implies eternal life if taken literally. All these life extension things would create other problems of their own, I suspect, on a societal level that we haven't fully confronted. But I mean, if you that sort of relatively modest extension of just like doubling human lifespan or something like that, it's very hard. I mean, it sounds absurd to call it modest. Obviously, it'd be a sort of unprecedented breakthrough. But I think, on the one hand, the finiteness would remain, and I'm sure we would ultimately be as desperate to avoid the confrontation with that finiteness. On the other hand, you would have more time. I don't think, from how I argue in the book and from how the philosophers that I've sort of explored on this, I don't think that the real problem with eternal life is when it goes on forever. And this is an argument that's been made against sort of certain kinds of religious conception of eternal life, right? And then Martin Hagland, in his really interesting book This Life, which came out a couple of years ago and that I mentioned in mine, makes this point that like nothing would ever be at stake if you lived forever in a literal sense. Nothing would ever be at stake because there'd be no reason to use any given day for anything. It would just be a sort of hellishly meaningless existence. But that clearly wouldn't be the case if we could live 200 years. So I'm not sure I'm against, making it so that we can have 8,000 weeks. I don't think it would solve any of our problems because we'd just reconfigure all our ambitions to exceed the new limit. But no, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Maybe
we have the
maybe
same problems, just over a longer time period, perhaps.
Yes, and presumably some overpopulation-related issues as well. But
presumably, even more so than we have at the moment.
Right.
Bringing things down to a slightly more terrestrial level. If you were in charge of a corporate law firm or in a situation where you were otherwise responsible for the kind of output and productivity of knowledge workers, what would you do differently to the way that things are currently?
Wow, it's a good question. And the first thing I want to say is that I don't think it's a given, as you often feel that it is assumed in conversations around this kind of topic. I don't feel it's necessarily a given that there's an answer here that that makes things much better for the employees while also being excellent for the bottom line of the corporation. It may be that these things are in a sort of real conflict, and that so if I was feeling virtuous, I'd have to do things that would sort of cause the law firm to suffer in some way. That said, I think there's two things that really spring to mind when I look at how people I know and people I'm aware of, companies I'm aware of are working, that where this goes wrong. The first one is just in terms of the way in which work is organized and the number of hours that are given to kind of deeply focused work. Cal Newport, who I'm sure you're well aware of, has written really eloquently on the way that like interrupt-driven workplaces are incredibly useless for any kind of work that benefits from deep reflection. And my sort of twist, or the thing I've tried to add to that discussion, is to say that like all, and I'm not the only person to do that either, but is that all the evidence from many, many people in history, but also from sort of more rigorously organized studies, is that you can't really do more than 3 or 4 hours of that in the course of a 24-hour period, and that you soon enter the area of diminishing returns or even negative returns if you keep pushing beyond that with that kind of deep work. So one thing is to sort of be very clear about the boundaries between deep and shallow work if you can. That's something I associate with Cal Newport especially. But then also to be really quite modest in the goals for the amount of time that's given to that kind of work, precisely so that it becomes a sustainable thing that people can put in day after day after day. And then I guess the whole other part of this that comes up in a bit more detail in the book is to do specifically in the world of law, though it has similar things operate elsewhere, is this kind of idea of the billable hour, the idea of thinking in specific, in like making the time and money connection so close that it has this incredibly sort of corrosive effect, as various people have argued, on the souls of the people doing it. You come to think of an hour as valuable to the extent that it is billable, and that, I think, has a sort of really deleterious effect on how you think about your leisure time or time with your family, or just even just other parts of the job that can't be translated into that. So I guess I would try to get rid of that. Maybe people already are getting rid of that in various corners of law. I suspect they are.
Yeah, and even beyond law, I mean, if we think about knowledge work more generally, there's a sort of, or at least, or work in general, there's many people who are still in this, or most of us are still in the kind of 9 to 5, almost factory output type of mode. But then there's actually our output as knowledge workers is very much, or usually, unrelated to the number of hours necessarily that are put in. But somehow I don't think that managers would look kindly on kind of workers taking long walks in the park or things like this as being productive activities. And yet we have many of our kind of insights, I'm sure you would agree, in the shower or going for a walk or something like that. So
yeah, I mean, you hope that those kind of results can be measured somehow, right? I mean, if we're right here that this leads to better outcomes, then it ought to be possible to see those better outcomes and to not sort of fixate on how they look like you're not working. But yeah, I guess that's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, I mean, computers in particular seem like fairly terrible places to do deep thinking in general. So, just coming on to kind of technology, I wonder what you think technology is doing to our expectations of productivity. Is it kind of changing the way we think about it in unhealthy ways, or do you see it differently? Or put
Sorry,
it
ask the
another
question
way,
again. Yeah.
why does better technology not result in increased leisure time?
Oh well, on the time use front, when it comes to technology, yeah, right. There is this kind of extremely bizarre seeming phenomenon whereby technology that saves us time doesn't result in people feeling more peaceful with regard to time. It's actually, more frustrating to wait for food to cook in a microwave, or to wait for a web page that's slow loading to finally load, than it is to wait for food in the oven, or wait for things to arrive in the snail mail. One of the arguments that I mean, there's a couple of things going on here, right? So one thing is that all sorts of technologies make it a lot easier to do a lot of stuff more efficiently, and then you get all the problems that come with efficiency, namely that, like, more efficient systems, if left unchecked, just attract more and more work. So the natural tendency, now that we can answer as many emails as we can answer in a day instead of how long it would have taken to write individual letters, the natural tendency of the system, the pressures from outside and the pressures from inside us, is to take on more and more and more work, or to receive more and more and more emails. So in that sense, you're just sort of reducing the friction with which people can get overwhelmed, and thus, not relieving their overwhelm. And then I guess also there is this kind of quite deep psychological thing going on, where the faster we're able to do things, like cook food in a microwave, and travel places in cars instead of horses and carts or whatever, the more you can do that, the nearer it feels like you've got to this position of, like, exerting total dominance over your time and capacity to sort of do everything exactly on the schedule that you want. And so the more frustrating it is that you still can't, right? So that last hour, 60 seconds between having food ready instantly and not is much more infuriating somehow than if it just has to, than if you're in a culture where you would just accept that it has to take 2 hours before it's ready. So I think both of those things are going on, probably.
Your book is full of really, really interesting ideas, and some that really challenge the way we think about things. One is this idea of settling, which seems quite antithetical to our current culture. But you make a very compelling and I think rarely heard case that it's necessary and even a good thing. So why is settling, however you want to define it, something we should embrace rather than run away from or avoid?
Well, there's a few concepts in the book. That's one of them, and then the other one is another one is procrastination, where I feel like if you really come up with a rigorous definition of them, you start to see that they are just an inevitable part of being a limited human, and therefore thinking that they're bad and should be escaped, as opposed to that you should try to do them in a wise way, is a sort of, you're on a hiding to nothing. And in the case of settling, that would just be to say, if you define settling in a relationship or a career or anything else as sort of accepting some imperfections or some limits in order to get some of what you desire, rather than holding out for the perfect person or the perfect job, well, that's just an inevitability of having finite time and being finite, and everybody being imperfect, and every job being one job and not having the good bits of every single job mixed up in it. Like, any decision to do anything with your time is a decision to not do a lot of other things, and so settling sort of built in. And equally, if you were to spend your whole life keeping your options open, never quite committing to any person or thing, that's a kind of settling too, because you're choosing the feeling of freedom of decision making over all the benefits you might be getting but are missing out on because you're holding back. So once you see then that this is, for any sort of rigorous definition of settling, it's just sort of built in, yeah, then the question becomes like how to do it best. And of course, that none of this means there aren't better and worse jobs and people and places. It just means that you're sort of facing the reality of the situation in a new way. That means you don't have to spend your time like panicking about the fact that you're settling per se, because you're going to be doing that whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting concept. Another one is this idea of synchronized time. And I wonder, should we revive or otherwise reinvigorate the Sabbath?
I think we should try. I mean, I'm not. There's some of these more collective aspects of the stuff I explore in the book do run into this question of like, okay, so how do you propose to go about doing that? I think one of the important points I try to make about the idea of the Sabbath in the book is not just something that I think has become quite well thought about in recent years, which is the idea that even secular people ought to be taking a day a week to not be connected to their devices, or to not be on email, or to not be working, whatever it might be. But also that it really mattered historically that it was the same day for everybody, or at least for a lot of people. There was this sort of synchrony rather, in how people were living their lives, so that you could expect that if you went calling on your neighbors at that day of the week, they'd be in and be in a headspace where they wanted to talk and be convivial, and or religious services at the simplest level, they just have to be at a certain time, right? That you don't get to choose as an individual, otherwise they can't happen as what they are. So yeah, I mean, what I'm drawing attention to here, I hope, is just this way that we have become so sort of out of sync with each other. This is true at the sort of bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, where people are working sort of unpredictable shifts, sort of bad contracts that bring them in to work dependent on when an algorithm decides they need to come into work. But it's also true of like people like me who have some freedom over their schedules and get to decide when they do things. Like, you're never free at the same time as your friends because they're all doing the same with their schedules, and so there's this kind of lack of fit. So anything that we can do, I'm not saying I have a ton of ideas right now, but anything we can do to sort of sync up our schedules a bit is likely to be a good thing. And that's as simple as, I mean, okay, one obvious thing is like, just join a club or organization, because those things meet and they have to meet at a certain time. And, therefore, by definition, you're going to be gathered with a bunch of other people at the same time.
Yeah. What did you learn about patience living in New York?
Well, the thing that you get, I love New York, and I and then it's a huge mixture of wonderful things and sort of annoying things, and then you sort of get used to the annoying things, and you even sort of take a perverse pride in living in a place with the annoying things. But the one thing that never we're in Yorkshire now for a year, but still basically very connected to New York City. The one thing I never stopped being massively irritated by is honking cars, drivers just honking their horns for just all the time for no reason. Like there's absolutely no safety reason for sure, and then also not even to speed up the traffic because it just doesn't work. And what they're mainly doing, as I suggest in the book anyway, is just sort of issuing an existential howl against the fact that they want reality to be moving at a different speed than it is. But as any good therapist would tell you, if you find something incredibly irritating in somebody else, it's probably touching something in you. And I reluctantly concede that possibly what I find irritating about the impatient motorists is that they're sort of partly drawing attention to my own impatience and remaining impatience. And I think that, New York is a good example of that, right? Fast moving cities where you can get a lot of things on a whim. It's not actually true, at least part of Brooklyn where we live, that you can order Korean food at 2 o'clock in the morning. I guarantee every restaurant in the neighborhood closes at like 10:30. But there is still a lot of convenience. There's a lot of speed. You can go and experience cuisines or art forms or meet up with fascinating people very, very easily and quickly compared to a lot of places. So you get this feeling of like, I'm very nearly in the driver's seat of life, right? Because, I can do all of this. I can eat like how I want to eat. I can get there in that. But of course, the effect of that then is that all the ways in which you aren't yet the god of your time, because you never will be, are just much more infuriating. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but already here in the North York Moors where we're living for the moment, life certainly moves at a sort of slower pace, but also there is all sorts of, I just do have to drive to a neighboring town if I want to buy groceries. It's just totally baked into the situation. And you just sort of don't question it, right? So the fact that something has been taken away from me, which is the ability to have a thought about an ingredient for a meal and go and buy it within 120 seconds of having the thought. And I'm apparently less annoyed by that than when it did take 120 seconds, but not 0 seconds. It's like it's so odd, and I really don't think it's just me being very odd.
No, I don't think so. You haven't had any luck buying Korean food at 2 a.m. in North Yorkshire.
No, I mean, you don't try, and it doesn't. It's not on the agenda, and therefore the fact that restaurant, in New York would have closed at 10 p.m. and you thought it was supposed to be open all night because hey, this is New York. It's like it doesn't arise. No.
I'm wondering if you have any practical tips on how we can both remain present in our lives and also kind of plan and work towards future goals kind of effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a super neat solution to any of this, but I write in the book about, I think where many of us, certainly those of us like me who are sort of compulsive planners, at least by our sort of family heritage, where we go wrong is not planning. It's not, coming up with a rough shape for the day or the week or the month. It's seeing that as some kind of effort to exert control over the future that you, in fact, can't exert because reality gets in the way, and then being constantly annoyed or anxious about the lack of fit between how you want things to go and how they seem to be going. The meditation teacher Joseph Goldstein has this wonderful line that we forget that a plan is just a thought, right? That it's like it's in the present. It's a statement of your intentions. It's totally useful as a way to help you make decisions. It's great to have a plan for the day when it's like 2:15 p.m. and the question arises, what should I do now? Like, it's brilliant if you can consult a sort of thought through plan. And obviously to do things like talk to other people for podcasts, you need to plan in certain ways. But you can do that, I think, without like gripping hold of the plan as a way you're trying to make reality go. The idea of just sort of being present in the moment is, while a very sort of alluring one, I think is equally challenging, because you can get just as instrumental about trying to be like, okay, I've got to really enjoy the moment and appreciate life's smaller pleasures, as you can be about much more sort of traditional kinds of instrumental focus. Yeah, I think there it's really just a question. The place where all this joins is just to see that, like, you always are only in the moment. Like, that's not a thing to try to do. That's just a fact about everything, including all your anxious thoughts and compulsive planning. It's all just happening now, and we're all sort of completely out in the dark about what's going to happen in the next moment, and totally vulnerable to events. And it's kind of scary, but on the other hand, remembering that it's completely inescapable, that there's nothing you can do about that situation, is in the nature of time. I do think there's quite a lot of relief in that as well.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions. This idea of being a digital nomad is quite popular at the moment. Is this one of those things that everyone should try once to realize that it's not really as great as it's made out to be?
There's plenty of things I write about in this book where I wonder, like, do you have to go through making these mistakes before you can understand the wisdom of it? I mean, I would not say I've ever been a digital nomad, really, but I have certainly headed off on sort of multi-week trips, I guess. Not no digital nomads tend to do it as a lifestyle, but where your idea is you're going to keep working, but you're going to be wherever you want to be, and the work you do can be done from anywhere, so you have this total control over your time. And as they then discover, and some have written about, what you discover is that, like, you're really lonely a lot of the time, because you've sort of uprooted yourself from the specific context in which most of us are embedded most of the time, and that really give a shape to your life. And again, just to contrast it with where we are here, like, I've got good friends and family in York, an hour's drive away, but right here, I've been here a few weeks, don't really know anybody, and yet even the very tenuous connections that one makes, people you nod to, your kid's school teacher, neighbors who you say hello to, even that level of familiarity and rhythm clearly means a lot, and counters this kind of idea of being totally atomized and solitary. Whereas being a digital nomad is sort of deliberately choosing the most atomized existence possible. Whether you have to try it, there's a really interesting question here, I think, about how many of these things you sort of have to experience downsides of for yourself. But
yeah, I've previously I used to, I suppose, idolize that type of lifestyle until I tried it, and I can completely relate to the feelings of loneliness and lack of connection that you talked about, because it is not all it's cracked up to be. Oliver, we're coming to the end of our time together, so just want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I want to ask you one last question. What is something, and I probably there's many things, but what is something that you changed your mind about in the course of writing this?
that's a really interesting question to me, because I definitely changed in the course of writing this book. I sort of had to be, I was discovering what I believed, I guess, as I wrote. And so I feel like I changed as a person in various ways, but expressing it in the context of sort of belief change or changing, that's a really, that is a question that, I'm sure I did change a whole lot of my beliefs as I was changing my behavior and my practices. But I suppose one thing that I would, this is maybe a little bit precise and technical, but bear with me. I think I'd sort of embraced a kind of slightly distorted pseudo version of the kind of Western Buddhism that's very popular these days, and would have thought at the beginning that, perhaps the perfect state to be in, not one that I had ever attained or would hope to had any hopes of attaining, but that you might want to be in, would be again, to be completely sort of totally present in this kind of desireless way, to sort of transcend the ego, all these things that you read about in the spirituality books, and not to sort of want anything out of life, and to be completely happy with exactly that seems like a good attitude to take toward time. But I think that what really emerged from writing this book is actually more a way of keeping your, you know, seeing that your natural sort of desires, your desire for self-improvement, your desire to change your circumstances, all this stuff, like these are things you have to sort of try to accept as well, I think, probably. And that it would be a kind of denial of your limitations to try to transcend those as well. So I think a big part of this book is about sort of finding ways to relate to the feelings of discomfort, of wanting things to be different than they are, of being impatient, angry, whatever, relating to them in a more healthy way, I guess, rather than trying to sort of get rid of them, which suddenly makes it sound a lot more like the last book I wrote. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
That's a conversation for another day.
Yes.
Well, Oliver, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time today. I will, of course, link to your book. I strongly recommend people read it. It's really, really good. There's a lot of really interesting ideas and really interesting thoughts in there. So it's a real gift to the world. And thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.